Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the monthly CPD Standards webinar. It's a delight to have so many of you with us today, and I'm just welcoming you all as you enter in through the waiting room. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name's Amanda. I am the CEO of the CPD Standards Office, and every month we come together as a community of trainers, coaches and online educators to give ourselves our own CPD and learn from each other within our global community. So it's a great pleasure to just welcome so many of you together today, especially on a Monday morning. And we're delighted to be welcoming Susi Miller, who's going to give us a masterclass in accessible and inclusive learning content. And obviously, for all of us, that's a subject quite close to our hearts. It's absolutely critical that we create, as educators, amazingly inclusive learning content. So today's session will be delivered by Susi. Any questions and observations, please use the chat to get a discussion going. If you have any specific information or questions regarding your membership with us, any assessment questions or queries, then please send a message directly to our wonderful colleague Kirsty Walker, who you'll see attending. And let's keep the chat focused on a CPD session for you. Now, with regards to the recording and the slides, they'll be circulated post-webinar, but also the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So you're very, very welcome to keep your cameras on. However, just keep in mind that you will be uploaded onto YouTube publicly. But we do like to see as many of you as possible. So a huge welcome to everybody that's joined us today. And with no further ado, I'll hand over to Susi to give us the masterclass for this morning. Welcome, Susi.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. That's really kind of you. So yes, really, I just wanted to start off by thanking Amanda, Kirsty, and also the CPD Standards Office for inviting me to run this session for you today. And I also wanted to echo Amanda and thank all of you really for giving up your very valuable time to find out more about making learning content both accessible and inclusive. Whether you're very impressively joining us live on this Monday morning, or if you have also very impressively made time to watch a recording of this masterclass. Okay, so without further ado, I'll begin by going through what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to start the session just by a scene setting, just a few points on scene setting, really, just addressing a few key issues. So we'll start with introductions and then move on to a useful definition and some important points around the case for making learning content accessible. I'll then move on to some key insights and outline how accessible learning content leads to better learning practitioners and better experiences for everyone. And next, I'll focus on the taking action, really important part of the session. And that will have some practical tips on improving the accessibility of learning content. So hopefully useful things for you to take away. And we'll finish then with some actual key takeaways and then the opportunity for some questions. Now, just before I begin, wanted to let you know that, that I have put together a takeaway sheet. So all of the resources that you'll see in the learning today, you'll be able to Kirsty will be sending that out after the session. So you don't have to worry too much about kind of making notes of the URL. So all of those resources you'll be able to find in the follow-up notes. And if at any point anyone would like the URLs shared, then Kirsty also has I've made them available to Kirsty, so she'll be able to post them in the chat for you. So hopefully that will give you kind of a bit of confidence that everything I'm covering you'll be able to access after the session. So as I say, what we'll start with is with the scene setting section. And I'm just going to start with a bit of background really about my own learning journey and how I became so passionate about accessibility. So I've been involved in learning and development for about 30 years really. And I started as an English teacher, and then I became an IT systems trainer, and I finally focused on designing and developing digital learning content. So I've really worked across the public, the private and charity sectors, and also in higher education. education, but it was really my experience there when I was working as an instructional designer in that kind of higher education setting that made me realize just how little support there was for people like me who wanted to make their learning content accessible to kind of these legal standards. And that was one of the main reasons I decided to start my own company. That's called eLaHub, and it's driven by the only slightly ambitious vision of making all learning content accessible and inclusive as the default. So a bit of a way to go, but we're making progress. So it was also the reason I wrote my book, Designing Accessible Learning Content, because I wanted there really to be a resource which was available for everyone, especially practitioners like me who wanted practical support to help them apply technical accessibility standards to learning content. And this is also a great opportunity to introduce you to the second edition of Designing Accessible Learning Content, which has been updated to the 2.2 standards. And it also has all of the insights that I've gained from working with a wide range of clients in different sectors since I wrote the first edition. So that's coming out in January next year. And another recent development for my introduction is that I found out only last week that I've also been selected as a finalist for the Learning Awards, Learning Profession of the Year. So that's really exciting. I just want to share that with you. Okay, so another important part of my introduction is why I became so passionate about this subject. I always think it's really vital to start any session on accessibility with a focus on the people that it affects. So in my experience, this is the spark which makes accessibility come alive. And it motivates people to get on board with accessibility. And it's also one of the vital ingredients which makes accessibility stick and makes people still motivated, engaged with it. So in my case, you can see the images that we have on the screen. Two of my first students that I taught many, many years ago. One of them was called Farisai, and she was actually a student that was blind. So she was in my class when I was teaching in Zimbabwe. Now, Farisai had what we called her readers. So we were studying English literature, and one of her readers is the other girl that you can see in this picture, and she was called Mercy. Now, the issue with the kind of, we had no accessibility, no assistive technology at the time. So what we did was we got some of the other pupils to read our texts aloud to Farisai, which was fine. But actually what happened was it made Farisai really rely on other people to help her. And what we really needed was something that she could do independently. So in our case, we were very lucky that Farisai could read Braille. So we managed to source some Braille books for Farisai, and it had such a huge impact on her and her ability to be independent and study independently and achieve what she was absolutely capable of on her own, that it had made a huge impact on me. So I'm just going to read a brief extract from Designing Accessible Learning Content now, which kind of summarizes exactly what this impact was that, as I say, has made such a lasting impression. So working with Farisai was one of the greatest privileges in my career. The experience forced me to reevaluate all of my assumptions about teaching and learning. It taught me to be more aware of the needs of my students and made me realize how important it was to be able to adapt to those needs, ultimately making me a far better teacher. Even more importantly, it made me rethink my attitude to disability. Working with Farisai showed me that her impairment or her disability in the form of her blindness was not in itself something which disabled her. She was just as bright and capable as the other students in her class, and with strategies and accommodations which allowed her to become more confident and independent, she was able to fulfill her potential. So this leads me into a really important definition of disability, which I found quite useful to clarify before we move on to explore accessibility in more detail. So Farisai's story is a great demonstration of the social model of disability. And that's based on the idea that disability is caused by barriers, which are created when products and services are not designed to include people with different access needs. But if these barriers are removed, then someone who is disabled can have an equal experience to everyone else. And for me, this definition of disability from the UN CRPD does a great job of articulating this concept. It says that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, and this is the important bit, in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So this focus on barriers is a vitally important theme when we consider accessibility. And this is because if a disability is partly caused by barriers, then every single one of us has the ability to find out about those barriers and enable equal access for all of our learners by removing them. And that, I believe, is the power of accessibility. At a time when we are acutely aware of the problems we face as a society, accessibility gives us the power to make a hugely positive impact on the lives of so many people. And this is why part of this session and every session I deliver always focuses on some practical accessibility tips that anyone can implement. But before we move on to the practical tips in this session, I just want to make a bit of time to focus on the case for accessibility. So although I appreciate that many of you will already be aware of the benefits of making digital and learning content accessible, I found that if I highlight a few key organizational benefits at the beginning of a session, it can really help to engage people and make sure that everyone is on board. So this is a technique I thoroughly recommend if you find yourself having to advocate for accessibility in your organization or with your team, with your manager, even with your CEO, for example. Something that I think anyone who is passionate about accessibility will, I'm sure, have experienced in the past or will in the future. So I've pulled out the top 3 benefits which I found to have the most impact. The first is a focus on how accessibility can help organizations enhance their reputation. So the basis of this case is that it is unethical and contrary to human rights to unnecessarily exclude disabled people from any aspect of life. So many people are aware that making learning content accessible is just the right thing to do, but not so many people might be aware that this is a concept which is actually enshrined in international law, again by the UN CRPD. And this exists to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life. An important aspect of UN CRPD, which many people aren't aware of, is that Article 9 specifically refers to access to information and communications technologies and systems as a fundamental human right. Another strong argument for this case is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015, and they include 17 goals building on the principle of leaving no one behind. The SDGs explicitly include disability and persons with disabilities 11 times. The one we shout out about most at eLaHub is number 10, reduced inequalities. So it really means a lot to us that we're part of a global movement for sustainable change. Let's move on now to the legal case. This is where accessibility tends to most commonly sit for organisations. Now that can be a shame because it promotes the mindset that accessibility is a risk and a constraint rather than an opportunity, but it's definitely an important consideration which we need to be aware of. If we have a quick look now at an overview of the international web accessibility laws and policies from W3C, you may be able to see a common theme. And that is that most legislation is underpinned by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG standards. And this is why W3C state that the WCAG standards are a single shared standard for web content accessibility that meets the needs of individuals, organisations, and governments internationally. Although we don't have time in this session to explore the legal side of accessibility in detail, it's always a useful reminder that meeting accessibility standards is a legal requirement for many organisations and is increasingly considered best practice for everyone else. There is one important new law coming into effect on June the 25th that we'll touch on briefly because it's already making a big impact on our clients that we've seen around the world. And that's the European Accessibility Act. That seeks to ensure that equal access to digital products and services throughout Europe. Unlike previous accessibility legislation, which often focused on the public sector, the EAA also covers private sector firms, which is partly why it's making quite a lot of impact. And that it refers basically to any private sector firms with at least 10 staff and a turnover of 2 million. Euros. But it also applies to any businesses that trade in the EU and all companies that are headquartered based outside the EU if they sell relevant goods or services within the EU. So I think the significance of this law is that the penalties that the European countries who are implementing it are imposing, they include significant fines. They can also include removal of non-accessible products from the market. And we've even seen examples of prison sentences. So the first time a really significant stick rather than a carrot incentive for accessibility. And we think this is, as I say, why it's making such a big impact even already on the client. So making sure that you're kind of ready for it by it being more aware of how to make your learning content accessibility is really becoming accessible is really becoming a priority. Okay, so my last point, and one that I think is becoming more and more important to organisations, is that a commitment to diversity, equity and inclusion is only really legitimate if it encompasses all lenses of diversity, and that includes disability. So to explore that further, we'll look at some statistics now from the World Economic Forum. So in research carried out in 2019, they found that 90% of companies prioritise diversity. But what percentage do you think consider disability? So there's no need to put anything in the chat, just have a little think and see. We've got 3 answers here. So we've got A is 4%, B is 14% and C is 24%. So just have a guess yourself and then I'll move to the next slide and show you that actually it was only in 2019 a staggering 4% that considered disability. As I say, that's according to research done by the World Economic Forum. So I'm not sure exactly how those figures would stand today, but judging by my own experiences and our experiences at eLaHub about how many organisations really understand or create legally accessible learning content, I'd guess that about 4% is probably quite an accurate estimate. Which brings me to the last slide in this section and a fantastic takeaway, I think, from an organisation called Disability is Diversity. They make the point that there is no diversity, equity and inclusion without disability. And of course, that also means accessibility. So their campaign is specifically aimed at the entertainment industry in the US, but I think it's equally relevant for our industry, for the L&D industry, or indeed all organisations who seek to have a legitimate commitment to diversity, equity and inclusion. So that concludes our scene setting section, and I hope it's been a useful introduction and maybe has helped to highlight some of those key organisational benefits of making learning content accessible before we move on. Of course, there are lots and lots of others, but as I say, these are the kind of 3 key ones that I find kind of make most impact and kind of make sure that everyone's on board before we move on to look at the kind of the in-depth side of making learning content accessible. So what we'll do now is look at what I call some key insights. So again, a bit of an introduction. One of the things that struck me, or I should more accurately say, added to my imposter syndrome when I was writing the first edition of Designing Accessible Learning Content, was that I only really had my own experience and that of a handful of other colleagues that I could draw on. But since then, my work with eLaHub has given me the huge and like immense privilege of working with a whole range of organisations committed to making their digital and learning content both accessible and inclusive. And just to give you an idea of some of the scope of what we've delivered, you can tell we did a lot of homework when we were putting our submission together for the Learning Awards. So we discovered that we've actually trained over 1,500 delegates, and we've provided support to over 235 organisations across 32 countries. And as I say, that is increasingly including European clients as a result of the EAA. So what you can see on the screen now is just a selection of some of our clients. And I wanted to really show that it's included organisations in private, the public or federal, charity and education sectors, and also importantly for us L&D providers as well. And this is where the real learning has taken place. So providing consultancy, auditing, and especially training has allowed me some really incredibly valuable insights, both into the benefits of accessible learning content, but also the issues that people and organisations can face when they're trying to make their learning content accessible. So what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the session are the key insights really that I've learned from that experience. And this is a quote based on a saying of Maya Angelou, and she said, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." So when I wrote the first edition of Designing Accessible Learning Content, or DALC, I'll call it now, I was doing the best I could at the time. Now, particularly after seeing so many examples of non-accessible content made accessible, I can do even better. So we'll start off with my number one evidence-based key insight, which is that creating accessible learning content definitely, unequivocally, and 100% leads to better learning practitioners. This is something that I've been convinced of for a long time, but I'm aware that it's an easy claim to make. So I'm now going to take the opportunity to share how both the evidence that I've gained from working with so many organisations and my own experience as a learning practitioner backs this up. So in the case of my own experience, I spent over a year working on transforming my book into an interactive and fully accessible online self-access program. You'll see quite a lot of examples of this as I go through the presentation. So working on this resource really gave me the opportunity to walk the walk and talk the talk for accessible learning content, and it has undoubtedly made me a much better learning practitioner. I've also had feedback from many of the delegates that I've trained that they've experienced the same thing. So how does designing and developing accessible learning content make better learning practitioners? First and most importantly, finding out how to make learning content accessible shifts the emphasis to a focus on the learner, because considering accessibility is a fundamental and transformational shift which puts learners at the center of the learning experience. In other words, it encourages learning practitioners to think with empathy about their learning audience. This is particularly the case in my own experience. So this is our screen reader tester, Kirsty Wolf. She runs her own language training and podcasting business. She has a lived experience of disability and has been using screen readers and assistive technology for over 20 years. So working closely with Kirsty was transformational in shifting my focus onto the experience of the learner. It's now impossible for me to design content without considering the different ways my learners will access the learning experiences that I'm creating. And for organisations who don't have access to people who have lived experiences of a disability, just encouraging them to work with what we call access needs personas. So particularly using many of the video resources that can be found on platforms like YouTube and Vimeo, we noticed that's led to a noticeable improvement in their focus on putting learners at the centre of the learning experience. The second reason I've identified that leads to better learning practitioners is because it forces them to challenge their existing practice. The best way I've found of describing what happens when you find out about accessibility comes from a quote from the writer Alvin Toffler, who famously said, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." While not everyone may agree with this concept of learning, unlearning, and relearning, I think for me, it really is the best description I've found of what happens to your practice as an instructional designer and developer when you design accessible learning content. It shifts the narrative from, am I doing this because it's the way I've always done it, to, am I doing this because it benefits my learners? So to give you an example of what that can look like, this is a case study from my work with the L&D team of a government client. And it demonstrates how accessibility training had a positive impact on the screen recording content in their learning resources. So the department created a lot of instructional videos on how to use the systems. Before their accessibility training, a lot of those screen recordings were created without a great deal of preparation. But as soon as the learning practitioners realised that they needed to add captions and transcripts to the videos, it made them create a script for each video. This not only made it much more efficient for them to make the videos accessible, but it also led to much more planned and professional recordings. So another hugely important benefit for learning practitioners is that because you have to think differently, it leads to innovation. A profound change in mindset is when you realise that accessibility equals innovation and not limitation. So I'll share one of my own examples now. This was an interactivity I created for students at a university, and it was a case where there was a clear learning justification for using a drag and drop interactivity, because we wanted to reinforce the use of recycling bins. We couldn't actually make them drop things into the recycling bins, but a drag and drop was the closest that we could get. But because the drag and drop activity in the authoring tool wasn't accessible, I combined an accessible multiple response question with animation paths to create a drag and drop interactivity. And that was accessible to both keyboard and screen reader users, as you can see on the screen now. You've got the yellow box which shows it's keyboard accessible. So I hope that helps demonstrate how accessibility can lead to thinking differently and to innovation. But that's a really basic example, especially when you compare this to what's happening in other industries, like the gaming industry, who are way ahead of L&D in understanding the potential of using accessibility as a driver for innovation, particularly in terms of accessible interactions. This is a great example from The Last of Us Part 2, which a few years ago was considered to be the most accessible game ever. I'm not sure whether it still is now, but you can see here how people with vision access needs in this example can tweak the settings to their own needs. So you can see here high contrast, and this other one here shows you, and if I just show you this with my mouse, which you might be able to see here. So there's a little directional arrow here near the subtitles, which shows where the sound is coming from. And that can make a huge difference to gamers with hearing access needs. Okay, so, and unlike the L&D industry, the gaming industry actively promotes accessibility, leading to innovation by rewarding it with recognition in industry awards. So there are just a few ways that I found that designing content which is accessible leads to better learning practitioners. But here's the thing, those better learning practitioners are designing and developing better learning experiences for everyone. Because accessible learning content, again, definitely, unequivocally, and 100% leads to a better learning experience for all learners, including people who have disabilities and access needs. So let's find out a bit more about why that is now. So we'll start with the benefit you would probably expect, and that is that accessible learning content includes people with a whole range of access needs. And for digital content, we tend to most often divide that into four different needs: vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive. Now, when it comes to motor access needs, in a digital context, it's worth explaining that that's referring to manual dexterity issues that impact learners' ability to use their mouse or fingers to interact with content. Their mouse to interact with content or their fingers to interact with mobile content. So instead, they use a range of assistive devices, most often on a keyboard, based on keyboard technology, to interact with digital content. Now, that's important because we're going to refer to it later. So I'll just give you some very, very quick examples of each of those types of access needs so that you have a bit more of an understanding of just how many people we're talking about when we're thinking about explaining, why it's so important to make our learning content accessible. So just a few examples of a huge range of different conditions that could impact any of our current or our future learners. But it might surprise you to find out just how many of our learning audience that this could impact. And according to some very interesting research carried out by the Boston Consulting Group last year, most organizations typically estimate that about 4% to 7% of their staff have disabilities. But according to this survey that covered 28,000 employees across 16 countries, so really impressive range of people that they surveyed, the actual figure was closer to 25% of employees who said they have a disability or health condition which limits a major life activity. So why is it that we're not so aware maybe of disabilities, people with disabilities in our workforces? And one of the main reasons for this, I think, is that a high percentage of disabilities are not visible or are hidden. So have a think now about how high that percentage might be. Again, no need to put anything in the chat. Just have a think. Okay, so we're very often unaware of the prevalence of disability in our organisations because, according to the global charity Hidden Disabilities, they use the sunflower symbol to help people show that they have a disability which you can't see. Up to 80%, so we often say between 70 and 80% of disabilities are non-visible. And remember also that with population aging predicted by the UN to be one of the most significant social transformations of the 21st century, absolutely crucial that we make sure that our learning content is suitable for our workforce who will naturally experience a range of access needs as they get older. In fact, according to the Employers Forum on Disability, 2% of the working age population becomes disabled every year, and 78% of disabled people acquire their disability age 16 or over. So really, just to summarize that important point, making our learning content accessible is the only way that we can be sure that we are including everyone in our workforce and audience, which will most definitely already have people with disabilities and access needs in it now. And it's also the only way that we can be certain our learning content is fit for purpose for our potential workforce and audience of the future. And that's why I believe it's so important to adopt this accessibility as the default approach. So let's move on now to our next tangible benefit of accessible learning content, and that is that it caters for our learners' circumstances, environments, and preferences. So we'll just start off with a very quick look at some circumstantial or temporary access needs. See if you can have a think about how some temporary circumstances might affect the ability of your learners to interact with content. So a quick look now at some temporary access needs that could impact any of us or any of our learners at any time. And as you can see, I've divided them into the four same categories of access needs that we've looked at. So you could have blurred vision due to eye surgery, hay fever, lost reading glasses, hearing loss due to a head cold, exposure to loud noise, blocked ears, etc. You could have a motor, injured hand or wrist, as you can see in the image. And then for cognitive, you could have tiredness, stress and anxiety, something that many of us have experienced. So let's move on now to situational or environmental access needs and how they could impact our learners. Again, you can see a picture which is an example of a motor access need, one that you might recognize from, it seems that's such a long time ago now, but maybe from COVID and lockdowns. So we have learning while caring for children and when home working. So all of these examples are focused really on learning content. For vision access, we could have learning on site with sunlight obscuring the screen, or slow internet connection when working at home, which prevents images from downloading. For hearing access needs, we could have learning on a noisy factory floor. For cognitive access needs, we could have learning in a distracting home or office environment. So I think it's important to say at this point that many disabled learners can find it frustrating when we use temporary and situational access needs to justify making our learning content accessible. I completely understand that point of view, but I think one advantage it does have is that it shifts the emphasis away from us versus them thinking, and it moves it simply to us thinking. This is that accessibility is something that can benefit any of us or any of our learners at any time. So by making our learning content accessible, we automatically cater to our learners' circumstances and environments. But it can also help us to accommodate different learner preferences. And this is because in order to make our learning accessible, we very often provide alternative ways of accessing the content. And we can have a look at that in action now from an example from the DALT program. So this example shows a scenario block which isn't fully accessible for someone who uses a screen reader. To make it accessible, I provided a text version of the scenario in an accordion block, but I've designed the block so that it still gives learners the opportunity to reflect and consider before I give the suggested correct answer and feedback. So this alternative would work equally well for a screen reader user or for maybe a learner who didn't want to work through every stage of the scenario. And this approach of providing our learners with alternative methods of accessing content also lies at the heart of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. This is a well-recognized and established framework designed to optimize learning for everyone, and it's based on scientific insights into how humans learn. Central to the UDL framework is the principle of providing multiple means of engagement, representation, action, and expression. So ultimately, accessible learning content adapts to a range of circumstances, environments, and preferences, caters for a wider audience, and provides a richer learning experience for everyone. Another thing, this is the last thing, another thing that accessible learning content does is tackle some common complaints about e-learning that you might be aware of. So although of course not always the case, I think it's true to say that many of us are aware that digital learning doesn't always have the best reputation. Unlike UDL, which is based on scientific insights, this list that I'm going to show you now is based on some common complaints, and it's based on nothing more than a quick poll of some of my connections on LinkedIn. But these are some of the most common issues that they identified. So you could have things like poor color contrast, making it difficult to read content, stressful and unhelpful assessments, distracting moving transitions and content, locked or difficult to navigate content, distracting narration on slides. And here's the thing about all of these complaints. They can be all fixed by following the standards and recommendations set out in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So we'll look at a couple of them a little bit later in our practical part. And this is the final point, I promise. It brings us on to the final benefit of accessible learning content, which is that it leads naturally to inclusive learning. But before we explore that further, we just need to unpack the difference between the two. So although I used to use them interchangeably, my experience over the last few years has been instrumental in demonstrating why and how they're different. Because even if we follow all of the web content accessibility guidelines, when we make our content accessible, that doesn't necessarily mean it's inclusive. As this still from the video accessibility versus inclusion shows, if we focus just on accessibility, it can be the equivalent of a person in a wheelchair being shown to their restaurant table through the kitchen, past the toilets, whilst their companions are welcomed through the front door. But my experience, by focusing on accessibility, you naturally start creating inclusive content. And that is learning by my definition that makes all learners feel welcomed, considered and valued, and it provides a good learner experience for everyone. And of course, in its wider sense, that means considering every lens of DE&I. But for the purposes of this session, we're going to just focus on people with disabilities and access needs. So we'll look at just a couple of tangible ways that we can make learning content inclusive. So here are just a few of the inclusive learning recommendations that we make to clients, often in our audits. You'll notice that none of them are about meeting these actual WCAG standards. They will just focus on how we can make learners with access needs feel welcomed and included. So the first, adding an accessibility statement, is a legal requirement for many organisations in the public sector. But even if it isn't, it's a fantastic way of showing you're committed to accessibility and you're doing your best to consider everyone's access needs. Another thing we suggest is using inclusive language, which doesn't make any assumptions about how people interact with content. So things like using select instead of click or enter instead of type. One to avoid now, and that's using text all in capital letters. So according to gov.uk, this makes it between 13 to 18% more difficult for all learners to read, but it's particularly difficult for some people with dyslexia. Most of us know to avoid this in our day-to-day digital content because it's considered similar to shouting, but we still see a lot of examples of this in the audits that we do at eLaHub. Another very common recommendation we make is that organisations consider using imagery which includes every lens of DE&I, and that means including people with a range of access needs, not just the one token stock image of someone in a wheelchair that, again, we often see in our audits. So the recommendations for making content more inclusive that we've just focused on promote this idea of a positive learning experience for everyone and ensure that everyone with access needs feels considered and welcomed. But as I said, none of them are actually these WCAG standards that you can pass or fail. But this is exactly what we're going to focus on in this next practical accessibility tips section. So these are the standards created by W3C that underpin most international legislation, as we touched on, and they're considered to be the best practice for making digital content accessible, and that obviously includes learning content. But as you can see from this slide, they can be quite overwhelming, especially if you're just getting started. So one of the things that we always tend to do when we're looking at making learning content accessible is making sure that we're covering all of those digital access needs. So each of the slides that we're going to be showing you later will be cross-referencing not only to the WCAG standard, but also telling you which of these particular access needs we'll be focusing on. And that's really to also make sure that I'm covering all of those access needs. Very often when we talk about accessibility, people tend to focus maybe primarily on sight because they're very aware of people who are using screen readers. So we're going to make sure that we have a broad looking at all of those different access needs. And the WCAG standards that we're going to fail, really, I've picked them out because these are the most common ones that we see in the audits that we carry out at eLaHub. So we're going to start off with our color contrast between the text and the background. Then we're going to have a look at color alone, especially used for feedback, which causes lots of issues. We're going to focus on captions, no captions being used, or some of the things that would make those captions fail if they were in a WCAG, if we were doing a WCAG audit. Inaccessible interactions used, focusing on things like drag and drop interactions, and then looking at moving content with no learner control. So we will start off with one of the most common ones, and I say surprisingly that we still see a lot of errors in the audits that we do about colour contrast. So it includes, actually it's a really important one, it includes people with a whole range of access needs. I'm sure some of you may be very familiar with this one, but I still think it's worth being aware of because it's, as I say, one of the most common WCAG standard violations that we come across. So there aren't actually any statistics for accessibility in the L&D industry, which I'm aware of, but I'd imagine if they were, they'd be very similar to those that you can find in the Web A Million report, which every year analyzes the accessibility of the top 1,000,000 global websites. Now, in their 2024 report, they had identified that a huge 81%, unbelievable, of homepages still fail the requirement for color contrast between text and background color. So we're just going to explore that in a little bit more detail now. So the key thing to be aware of when it comes to making color accessible is that it applies to the contrast ratio between two colors. So you can see some examples in the slide that I have here, and I want you to have a look at the third circle along, which is the green one, which has a green circle and then white text in it. So again, I'm not going to ask you to put anything in the chat, but just have a think now. For you, is that good color contrast? Is that easy to see? That's one question. So it may be for you, may not be. The other question is, do you think that would pass the Web Content Accessibility Guideline? The ratio that you need to meet for that is 4.5 to 1. So obviously that's quite a difficult question to answer. How do you know whether that is meeting the color contrast between the text and the background? The easiest way to do this is to use a color contrast checker. Now, one that I recommend quite a lot to people, just simply because it's a website, you don't need to download anything is the Web Aim contrast checker, and that's the one that you can see here. So if you have the values of the two colors that you're checking, you can simply enter them into the two fields that you can see here. However, if you don't have the values, then you can use the color. There's a color picker already built in the tool, and there's lots of other contrast checkers that have these as well, and standalone color pickers as well. So I'm going to show you a video now, which shows you how you can use the picker to identify and to put in the color contrast values if you don't have it. It's very easy to do. And if you do come up with a failure, then how you can actually use the slider, the lightness slider, to change the value until it actually meets requirements. So that's what I'm going to show you in this little video now. It doesn't have any sounds, so you'll just see me using this color contrast checker. And first of all, just picking up that little tool and going off to my slide and picking up the green, and obviously one of the defaults is the white there. So you can see immediately that that's not meeting that requirement. It's 2.22 to 1. And now I'm using the luminance slider and pulling it across and making that green darker until it passes the WCAG standard. So a really easy way to make sure that you are checking your color contrast, and also to changing it if you find that your color contrast that you're using isn't meeting it. So you can change either of those values to make sure that you're meeting the WCAG requirement. So one of the things that we found, again, this is very valuable in working with organizations, is the reason why this often fails. And that's because a lot of organizations are working with a brand palette, very similar to what you can see on the screen here. And that's kind of a palette of different colors, just single colors. But the most important thing to be aware of is that those colors themselves are not either inaccessible or accessible. It's when they're used in combination with others. So what you really need is a grid that tells you exactly which of those color combinations you can use together. Luckily, we found a tool in our toolkit which helps us to do exactly that. So you can plug in the color values of your brand palette, and it will tell you exactly which ones can work together and are accessible and which ones aren't. So a really, really key tool that we use a lot in our own work and when we're working with clients. Okay, so the next one that we're going to look at is using color alone. And again, this is a really common issue, again, for access needs, but this time it focuses on learners who have color vision deficiency or are colorblind. So the example that you can see here shows how if you convey information just using color alone, it can make it impossible to process if an answer is right or wrong. You can see in this example that the answer changes to red if it's placed in the wrong segment of the Venn diagram, and to green if it's in the correct segment of the diagram. diagram. So that would fail the WCAG standard, and that's because it's only using colour and not using any other device such as text or icons to convey this information. And it means that someone who's colourblind would very likely not be able to interpret this information. This is how someone with protanopia or red blind colour deficiency would see this feedback. And you can see it's barely possible to distinguish between the correct and incorrect answers. So that image was created with a colourblind simulator, but you don't actually need to use one of those to check your use of colour for feedback. A top practical tip to check this standard is simply to apply a grayscale to your content, as you can see in this example here. And you can see another example here. This again is something that we see a lot. If you have feedback which is just using an overlay to tell, so in this example, you can see that there's a red overlay on the screen. That is basically also failing this standard, because it's just using the color red to show whether this is actually incorrect. But if you supplement that with an icon and with text, then you're passing that standard. So you're not just using text alone. And again, if you use that color, apply the grayscale, you can see immediately that second example will be able to be interpreted by anyone, even if they are colorblind or have color vision deficiency. Okay, the next one to look at for vision is looking at alternative text. So really important that you make sure that any images that you're adding to your content which provide meaning, actually you provide alternative text. And this is an example I'm using the RISE authoring tool of how you can add alternative text to this image. And one thing that I also wanted to talk about now was because of how useful AI can be when it comes to making accessibility easier. This is an example of the ChatGPT text assistant, which I use very often now, and it's a great starting point for your alternative text. It can save a lot of time. It's quite accurate in the alternative text it comes up with. It still needs to be checked, but it's a really great way to kind of speed up creating alternative text, and you can create either kind of a short description or quite a detailed long description using that assistant. So I really recommend you having a look at that. And the next one thing to be aware of when it comes to alternative text is to make sure that you're hiding any decorative images. So again, this is an example using an Articulate tool. This time it's Storyline, and it shows you how important it is to make sure that any content, images that are not adding meaning, are hidden. So if you don't do this, which in this case is just tick this little box, you will get your screen reader will be reading out background transparency, rectangle, and things like this. So that's an overview of some of the real key things to be aware of when it comes to vision. When we look at hearing, captions for equivalent experience is really, really important and worth having a look at in more detail. So the first issue that I'm still staggered to find when I'm doing audits is that some videos in learning content simply don't have any captions at all. And that corresponds with research that was shared by the charity Scope a few years ago, which identified lack of captions as really the #1 barrier to equal access to learning content in workplace learning. But even if organisations do provide captions, we still see some common issues which prevent captions from providing an equivalent experience. So it's worth a reminder that captions need to be synchronized to the action. So just providing a transcript isn't enough. They also need to be descriptive, which means they contain things like important sound effects, who's speaking, and emotions conveyed by tone of voice, which someone who's deaf or hard of hearing might miss. And finally, which we see is by far the most issue in audits, is that captions also need to be accurate, with punctuation and with no mistakes, so that they're easy to process and understand. So many organisations fail the caption standard in accessibility audits because they use videos with auto-generated captions which don't have any punctuation but do have a lot of grammar and spelling mistakes. So let's move on now to another common issue which we often find in our audits, and this time we're looking at motor access needs. So we'll just have a very quick look at a montage showing some different conditions which affect manual dexterity, so they can be both permanent and situational. And you can see a whole range of different assistive technology that is being used here. But as I said at the beginning, it's really important to be aware that a lot of people with motor access needs will use assistive technology which is based on keyboard functionality. And this is where we see a lot of issues. So activities such as drag and drop interactions are very often not keyboard accessible, because somebody who is not able to use a mouse or their finger is not able to drag and drop those, drag and drop the answers. So a really important thing to be aware of if you're a learning practitioner is to understand your tool and to find out which of the interactivities in your tool is accessible. And we've got a really good example here of the H5P tool, which actually tells you which of its interactions are accessible. Sometimes you need to kind of do digging yourself and work out which ones are accessible. So it's really important to be aware of your tool and how to make that learning content accessible. Be aware of maybe go in and do some digging, or ask your authoring tool provider to tell you which ones are keyboard accessible. Okay, so moving on now to another really common issue that we have, and this time we're focusing really on cognitive access needs. So we have a standard which benefits everyone, but it's particularly important for people who have neurodivergent conditions, particularly things like dyslexia, ADHD, or autism. Now, this standard is very aptly named. It's called pause, stop, or hide. And it applies to any content that starts automatically, moves for longer than 5 seconds, and appears alongside other content. So I'm going to play this slide for you now. And what you can see as how this moving content on this slide is, you've got a video here that's been added for decoration and for interest, but what it can do is it can really it can be really distracting for people, and what it can do is actually stop people being able to process the information. So personally, I'm dyslexic. I find it incredibly difficult to process information if I have moving content on the screen. So an easy thing that you can do, not saying strip out all content which moves from your learning resources. However, you can see that, again, this is another example. It can be easily fixed by giving learners control. That's a really important concept for accessibility. So giving them the ability, for example, to pause, stop, or hide the moving content. And as you can see in this example, there's just a little pause button at the bottom of that, the interaction or the little video that's been added there. And that can allow someone to be able to effectively then process the content and interact with that the content that and read and understand what's happening on the slide, as opposed to being distracted by what's moving on the slide. Okay, so I hope everyone, regardless of your role within learning, has managed to find something useful from those practical tips on making learning content accessible and inclusive, and also the kind of the background that we have. I think it's really important to cover the case for accessibility and understanding why this is so important. I'm just going to finish now with a couple of key takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. And the first is that accessibility can very often feel quite overwhelming. So I hope this masterclass has maybe been a first step in making it a little bit less so. But a mantra that I repeatedly come back to, and I suggest for all of our clients, is progress over perfection. So things probably won't be where they need to be now, but you'll probably make some mistakes as you try and make your learning content accessible. But every small step you take will have a huge impact on your learners. And that leads me nicely to my next final takeaway, which is a really fantastic quote that I really come back to all the time. It says, the one argument for accessibility which doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our job a little bit better? And that comes from Steve Krug. So I'll finish on the final slide, and that really is just a kind of a QR code which will link to more information about that designing accessible learning content program, the online self-access course. So of course that is fully accredited by the CPD. We think it's hugely important to boost professional recognition in the industry. And if you want to access that, that will also allow you 9 free lessons if you want to have a look at some of the lessons in our showcase module. So that brings me on to question and answer.
First of all, thank you, Susie. What a valuable, insightful, helpful webinar. I think the whole community here on the session today has found that so useful, and
that's great to know.
Your expertise has been really, really helpful for everybody. There's a whole chain of messages that have gone on during the chat as we've had the session through. Lots of people thanking you for your time and for your insights. If I just can ask somebody to just drop a key question that they've got in the chat. There's some great points that have been made in terms of different resources such as webaim.org. There's also been links put in the chat regarding the WCAG developments. Points also made about learning styles, questions about the Equality Act. Actually, that's probably a good one to start with.
Okay.
So we've only got 6 minutes now for questions. So
Okay.
Andy has asked, what about the Equality Act 2010 effects on this? That was earlier on during the webinar, but it'd be good to get your view on what that legislation means for us.
So the Equality Act is a really interesting one because the Equality Act really underpins what happens from a kind of discrimination, anti-discrimination point of view in the UK. It's very similar to the legislation that you have in America, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it kind of underpins everything. The issue about that one, although it underpins everything, it doesn't. Because it talks about making reasonable adjustments, kind of from a legal point of view, reasonable adjustments normally will come down to the fact that you need to be meeting the web content accessibility guidelines. But what we had in 2018 was the public sector bodies accessibility regulations, and that actually only applies to the public sector. However, it's now considered to be sort of best practice for everybody. And that for the first time explicitly stated that you needed to meet the web content accessibility guidelines level A and AA to be making sure that your learning content was legally accessible. So as I say, that the Equality Act kind of underpins everything, but the public sector bodies for the first time really explicitly stated that it's the web content accessibility guidelines that you need to be making. Although, as I say, it's kind of normally when you get to making reasonable adjustments from a digital point of view, it does come down to the web content accessibility guidelines, but it clearly states in those public sector bodies accessibility regulations that that's the case.
And I've just got a quick question on that because you know, we work with every type of training organisation possible. The word reasonable adjustments has been used significantly over the last 14 years. Is there a best practice policy that somebody could adopt on that? Because I know for training organisations that are new to the field, and in terms of its definition, the word reasonable adjustments can probably mean different things to different people. So do you have any advice on that?
So I'd say from a kind of like looking at reasonable adjustments, you know, the wider reasonable adjustments that you could be making from a workplace, that isn't something that I specialize in. However, from a digital point of view, I would say the ideal scenario, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, is if you make your learning content accessible to the web content accessibility guidelines and inclusive, so it's a good learner experience for someone. You shouldn't ever need to get to the stage where you're needing to make adjustments to that learning, because by definition, it's accessible by default. So in an ideal world, that's what I think we could try and aim for, is to make sure that all of our learning content, in an ideal, obviously digital content, is accessible and inclusive as the default. However, you know, if you are looking at making reasonable adjustments, and if you have someone that says, you know, I'm not able to access this content, then certainly your first port of call would be, right, okay, I need to look at those web content accessibility guidelines. Because very often those guidelines are making sure that the content is accessible for people who are using assistive technology. And very often in the work environment, it is people who are using assistive technology who need maybe some adjustments to make sure that assistive technology is working with your content.
Yeah, I see, understand. And Catherine has noted that EHRC Employers Code 6.28 sets out decision-making required when adjustments are reasonable or not. I think just one last point is, are there any plans to provide an audible version of your book, please?
So I think I think there is an Audible version that, again, this comes more to the publisher, but I think there is an Audible version. And I think certainly I will double check and get back to you with making sure that there is one for the second edition. I've got a feeling that there is. I'm not sure if
Okay.
it's not as easy to get hold of, or people, they're not talking about it enough. So I'll have a chat with them, but definitely for the second edition, I'll make sure that that's, screaming.
Okay. And I
Yeah.
just want to end with this comment, because I think it's wonderful. It's from Adam. Adam King. Just want to say thank you. The text designing accessible learning has helped so much in preparation for my interview as a digital accessibility apprentice.
Oh.
That role has quite literally changed my life.
Oh,
so thank
honestly.
you. And that's what we want to do every month, is to bring CPD standards community together to learn from one another. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone on this call for such a useful and insightful session today.
Oh, thank you so much.
So on the screen here is information about the DALC programme. As I said, we'll circulate the slides and the recording. And Susie, if you're happy to, we'll also circulate your LinkedIn profile for people that want to connect with you.
Yes, and if there are any questions that we haven't been able to address, I know that I have. I always go on a bit too long. So,
no, you've been fine.
Yeah, so any questions that you have, I'm really, really happy to, if you want to contact me on LinkedIn to answer any questions, it'd be great to be in contact.
Okay, lovely. All right then, Susie, we'll have a wonderful week. And to everybody else, happy Monday. That's a great, insightful piece of CPD for us to get started. And we'll look forward to welcoming you again next month. So take care, everybody.
Many thanks again.
Many thanks. Bye-bye.